Hello and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the Pensions and Combined HR Solutions team at Gowling WLG. I'm Ian Chapman-Curry, a legal director in the Pensions team, and I'm joined today by Richard Lee, a partner in the CHRS team. Hello, Richard.
Hi, Ian. Morning, everyone.
So today we're going to be looking at the pensions and employee benefits aspects of the current COVID-19 crisis, and in particular the government's coronavirus job retention scheme and what it means for pensions. Just before we get into that and put this into a bit of scale as to why this is an issue that is causing so much interest and attention across the UK business community, I had a look this morning on the tracking of the number of cases being done by Johns Hopkins University. At 9 o'clock this morning, there were 938,373 confirmed cases, so just shy of 1 million cases across the world. Sadly, that's brought a total number of deaths of 47,273. On a more positive note, 194,405 people have so far recovered. So it's definitely a case of business, but definitely not business as usual. And just a couple of indicators to demonstrate that. Some of you will be familiar with the Purchasing Managers Composite Index, where groups of purchasing managers across manufacturing and service sectors say whether they're confident of placing more or fewer orders in the forthcoming month. Any sign above 50 is a sign of growth. Anything less than 50 indicates contraction. In January, at the beginning of the year, after the December general election, the economy showed signs of improving with a score of 52.7. That grew to be stronger in February with a score of 53. And has slumped in March down to 37.6, so demonstrating some real concerns for the UK economy. And on the investment side, we'll take the FTSE 250 as a benchmark, a useful indicator of the health of UK PLC, and we can see that it reached a peak just before the crisis of just over 22,000 points, and then slumped to 12,000 points before recovering slightly, but nowhere near enough to make up those differences. So we can see why some of those indicators are as they are. The government has issued perhaps the clearest and most comprehensive message to the public seen since the Second World War, to stay home, to save the NHS and to save lives. Whole swathes of the UK economy have been closed. All retail other than essentials, restaurants, pubs, hotels, the whole range that you can see up there. And other sectors are profoundly affected as well. So the obvious ones, transportation and aviation, leisure and tourism, but also ones like construction. Whole building sites across the UK are no longer working on construction. It's having an impact across the board. So we're going to go to the meat of this session. We're looking at furlough job retention. Just before I hand over to Richard to really focus on that, I just want to remind you all that you can submit questions using the question option on your controls. We'll be looking at questions that come in and aiming to answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. We've got a wide range of people on the call. We've got people who are pension purists, people who are trustees, HR managers, and people who focus at this more from a pure employment point of view. So a whole wide range of views possible there. If you put your question with your name, if you don't use the anonymous tab, then even if we don't get to your question, in the time that we have, we will pick it up and get someone from the team to get in touch. And we're also going to put together a composite Q&A document of common questions and our responses to those afterwards, together with a recording of this session, if that's useful for you. So over to Richard. Furloughing, job retention, what does it mean? How does it work?
Thanks very much, Ian. And to reiterate that we understand just how difficult this is at the moment for everybody, and we hope that you're all staying safe and well. So furlough leave, the informal name for the job retention scheme. You'll have noticed, or many of you will have noticed, that British Airways announced yesterday that they will be putting 36,000 of their employees onto furlough leave, which is approximately 80% of their UK-based employees. Some of you might have been on our employment webinar on Monday, but as Ian's mentioned, we have a range of people on this webinar, so we're going to just build up piece by piece. It's extremely important that everyone understands the basics of the job retention scheme, the JRS, or furlough leave. So this is a temporary scheme only, open to all UK employers for at least 3 months, the government's current position, and it's possible for employers to put employees on furlough leave with effect from the 1st of March. Employers can claim up to 80% of furloughed employees' usual wage costs, plus the associated employer NICs, and importantly for our purposes today, minimum automatic enrolment employer pension contributions on that wage. And I emphasise in there the minimum automatic enrolment employer pension contributions. So that's the very basic position. The next slide will take us into a bit more of an explanation. So what does it mean, and how do employers get their money back? So the important point to remember is that this is for employees. It does not cover self-employed. There are separate initiatives to deal with that, but it does cover 0 hours employees. The basic position at the moment, and many of you will understand that this changes currently on a daily, if not hourly basis, but the government's aim is to have these payments up and running in time for April payrolls. So that's the current timeline for Her Majesty's government in setting up all of the new systems to deal with these payments. And essentially, we are talking about a new relationship for employers who apply to furlough their staff. They will have a new relationship with Her Majesty's government. It doesn't exist in that way at the moment, but the employment relationship stays the same. That's an important point that we all need to understand. The employment relationship stays the same. So just looking at a little bit more detail on furloughing and what it consists of. You can get more details through our link, which is available below, and through the government link. There is a risk at the moment with information overload, and particularly for those of us who work in the pensions, employment, HR, and benefits industry, because we are having to keep up with all of the different streams of developments. So we'll now just step into the headlines for pensions and benefits before we come back to Ian for more pensions specific developments. So furloughing, or JRS. Can we take advantage of this scheme as an employer? Yes, you can, provided you employed these employees with effect from the 28th of February. So they have to be on your PAYE on the 28th of February. And you can apply for those employees to be on this scheme with effect from the 1st of March. What does it mean? Well, it means that your employees who you place or who agree to go on furlough leave remain as employees, but their pay and potentially their benefits are adjusted. So they remain in employment. There's no change in their employment status, which again we'll come back to. It's an important theme for pensions and benefits. Can you just tell employees they're furloughed? No, you cannot. In the same way, you could not simply say, we're cutting your pay by 50% from tomorrow. So none of these new provisions, and there is no new law yet, we're all working on guidance. So none of these new provisions or schemes change the way in which employees need to be dealt with in this situation. So there will need to be a negotiation process, an agreement process to put in place furlough agreements. And some of you will already have been looking at those and in fact may well have already agreed furlough agreement with your unions or collective workforce. But you cannot simply tell employees they're furloughed from next week. Now, what about the money that Her Majesty's government's not reimbursing? Do you have to make up the difference to 100%? Because you will only be reimbursed for 80%. No, you do not. That is an entirely commercial decision for each employer to make. Next, and this is an interesting question, can we furlough people part-time? That doesn't mean we're not asking, can we furlough part-time people? The question is, can we furlough people part-time? So can you furlough someone for 50% of their time? No, you cannot. That's the answer. You cannot furlough people part-time. You can furlough part-time people. Can employees on furlough work for anyone else? Yes, they can work for other employers. This is an employer-specific scheme. So provided that they are entirely separate jobs, separate employers, they can continue to work for other employers. So those are the key basics of this regime. And those are the issues we'll keep coming back to when we're looking at the pensions and benefits aspects.
That's really interesting, Richard. One of the things that just made me wonder is if you have a serious reduction in the amount of work, that means that you would like to furlough a percentage of your people. Is that permitted, or does that fall foul of the of furloughing people part-time, and are there any issues with doing that?
So you can furlough in and furlough out. It's quite a common question in terms of smoothing industrial relations, for example. Can we furlough one group for 2 weeks and then furlough another group for 2 weeks? Because in that way we avoid any issues between those groups, those who are being paid for not doing work and those who are still having to carry out their work. So that type of furloughing is permitted. What you can't do is split individuals down the middle and put them on half furlough leave. For these purposes, they are either working or they are not working, and that's the basic position. Now, just before we go back to Ian and some more pensions aspect in depth, just wanted to start you thinking about this theme of other benefits. It's similar in terms of the considerations for pensions benefits. So whether or not your arrangement is through an occupational scheme or separate standalone insured scheme, it's going to be crucial, as it will be for pensions, to check the scheme rules in relation to definitions of earnings, wages, salary, basic pay, and to check exactly what they would or wouldn't cover in terms of furlough pay, and in terms of insured arrangements, check what the policy documents cover in terms of the definitions, the similar definitions, and exactly which benefit is insured for these purposes and which level of pay will be insured for these purposes. So that's again another common theme of analysis that we will all need to go through. Thanks, Ian. So headlines for employers. Is furlough leave covered by the absence rule? That is important. Again, as an analysis, you need to establish how employees are going to be treated for these purposes. And we've already seen some absence rules which allow employers to dictate exactly how the members are treated for benefit purposes during absence. It's a unilateral power in some cases. So is there anything in your absence rules which needs to be checked in terms of furloughing employees? As I'd mentioned on the death in service benefits and insured benefits, how are contributions and pensionable pay defined? We'll keep coming back to this point, it's absolutely crucial. What's the basis for the contributions, pensionable pay during a period of furlough leave? And is the employer seeking contractual agreement to any changes? Where there are contractual promises of certain contribution rates, for example, then consultation, potential negotiation will need to be carried out. So as well as the pensions side analysis, there clearly is the employment contract union side analysis to go through, because again, just to remind you, you cannot simply notify employees that you're putting them on furlough leave, because that is not provided for within the current legal regime. And then finally, of course, when you've reached an agreement and you've got clarity on the position on furlough, you need to make sure that on the administration side with the trustees, that that has been accurately reflected through the furlough leave period. So just looking at some more detailed elements of this, and we're getting a lot of questions on this. I'm going to roll with these as ongoing. A lot of these questions will be picked up by the slides that we're already covering. So I'll carry on now on this piece and keep sending you questions in. So there's the potential mismatch between the amount which an employer can be reimbursed for and normal pension contributions. And again, it's a commercial decision for employers to decide the level at which they're going to continue to make contributions or to allow earnings to continue during this period. The regulator has been clear, the Pensions Regulator has been clear that employer duties under the Pensions Act 2008, which for those of you who are not aware is the act which covers the automatic enrolment provision, those will all apply as normal, at least for the moment. So it will not be possible for the moment for employers to reduce contribution levels below the automatic enrolment minimum contribution rates. So if you are proposing to reduce rates which are above these minimums, you will still need to apply the minimum automatic enrolment contribution rates. And the consultation provision, as I've mentioned previously, pensions consultation on statutory listed changes, which would normally include things like closure of a scheme to accrual, which employers may be considering, those that still have DB, defined benefit open schemes, for example, and also reductions to percentage rates of employer contributions would require a minimum 60-day consultation. Some of you may be thinking, well, that timeline is just not going to work, and that might be very true. It is possible to apply the regulator for a waiver, and failing to go through the full 60-day process does not annul the changes, but you should be aware that the regulator could levy a fine of up to 50,000 per employer. And then finally, employment contracts, which I've mentioned before, do not forget about them. And introducing furloughed provisions, you need to have reviewed the contractual position so that your collective bodies and your employees are fully engaged when agreeing variations if that's necessary. So I think that's the end of that first section. Over to Ian.
Yeah, so thanks for noting the point about the Pensions Regulator. I'm just going to bring everyone up to speed with what the Pensions Regulator has been saying as recently as its information published on Friday. Worth pointing out, this is an incredibly interesting subject to so many people. I've personally not been on a webinar with as many people. I think if this was a lecture theatre, I would be decidedly less relaxed about presenting to the number of people. And we're also getting a huge number of questions. So thank you for those. We'll be dealing with as many of those as we can. And like I said, we will be answering them both offline and in a composite Q&A document for you. So let's focus on what the Pensions Regulator has said. First of all, it's had some key messages. The Pensions Regulator has emphasised that benefits need to be paid. At the moment, things are scary enough for the elderly. They don't need to have the worry that pensions are not going to be paid. So that's number one in the list. Number two, and this is a sad reflection, but in times of crisis, there will always be some people who will try and make some money out of the confusion. So the Pensions Regulator is emphasising the risk of scams, especially when you have individuals who may need to get hold of money as a result of losing jobs, losing income, and the potential there for scammers is quite high. The Pensions Regulator has also emphasised that employers need to continue contributing, but we'll come on to a slight caveat to that with its latest guidance in a moment. On the defined contribution money purchase side, the Pensions Regulator says that savers need support to make good decisions in these challenging circumstances. And if you just remember the graph of the FTSE 250 a moment ago, this is an indication of just how challenging the circumstances are. So communications and messages that can be given to people to try and focus on the long term and not make rash decisions on the DC pension savings. And finally, the Pensions Regulator is aware that there may be some administrative breaches that occur and that they will be adopting a proportionate and fair approach to any action that they take in relation to those. So, you know, it can't suspend the statutory regimes, but it can adopt a degree of flexibility. So the Pensions Regulator then goes into more detail on each of the areas of what it expects from trustees. One of its main focuses has been around business continuity, and some of the trustee attendees on this call will be familiar with having to put in place risk management measures as a board of trustees, and business continuity is an important element of that. Business continuity means looking at people like your third-party service providers and making sure that they are able to continue to function even if they're having to work remotely. But it's also things like how trustees can continue to take decisions and stay in charge of the pension scheme whilst they're no longer at the moment able potentially to meet in person. Another key message is on prioritisation. As we mentioned just before, the Pensions Regulator wants trustees to prioritise the payment of pensions, and there are a whole series of things that have higher priority according to the Pensions Regulator than some other things. So prioritising retirement, prioritising death in service payments. It might be that the scheme is undergoing certain large projects. It might be sensible for those to be paused whilst the trustees make sure that those priority tasks can be fulfilled. Corporate distress, the Pensions Regulator is alive to the issues, especially in certain sectors where perhaps previously strong-looking employers, employers with strong financial employer covenants, suddenly look like their business models have been upended. TPR encourages trustees to get in touch if they think that there is a risk of insolvency, or if indeed insolvency is more than a risk, if that is actually going ahead. Scams we covered briefly, but just to mention that what the Pensions Regulator would like trustees to do is to look at Scam Smart, is to signpost effectively people to the Money and Pensions Service, to treat transfer requests with perhaps even a higher degree of caution than it usually would, and just be alive to the risk of scams at the moment, and ensure that all of the proper communications and literature, the old, the Scorpion style leaflet, has been sent out to members at the right times. And then on administration, and this is connected to business continuity and prioritisation, ensuring that the administrators, whether that's in-house or third party, are able to continue to administer the scheme. A lot of that comes down to business continuity and making sure that the priority areas are focused on. And then finally, around employers, a message for employers that the Pensions Regulator understands the pressures that are on all employers in the UK economy, and some in particular sectors under unbearable pressures, but to be mindful of the duties that are still owed, and to talk to the Pensions Regulator where possible. Some other impacts of the coronavirus on the Pensions Regulator has been a postponement of various things like the regulatory initiatives, consultations on changes to the Code of Practice, like the revised DB funding Code of Practice, and the long-term TPR strategy launch being postponed. Those all still going to come back when we get to business as usual, but obviously no one knows when business as usual will be. All of these materials, together with information that I'm about to come on, available at a single homepage on the Pensions Regulator webpage, which you can visit at tinyurl.com/TPR COVID. So moving on to the next slide, bit of breaking news. I mean, this is pensions. This happened on Friday, so as far as we're concerned, this is breaking news. We don't operate as a 24-hour news cycle in the way that some areas do, but this is still pretty novel. The Pensions Regulator published 3 pieces of guidance, one for trustees focusing on scheme funding and investment, one for employers looking at scheme funding in particular, and then on the DC side, looking at investment and transfer values. Probably the most interesting, certainly the longest of these, is the guidance for trustees on scheme funding and investment, and it just puts a lot more detail on the parameters around things like employers asking for a suspension or reduction in deficit repair contributions, the things trustees need to take into account if they're considering those sorts of things, and also looking at whether the scheme's risk portfolio, its investment range remains appropriate, getting advice from investment advisors to look at those aspects, and also thinking about whether there's been a material shift in the strength of the employer covenant such that it might require the trustees to think about taking some action in terms of trying to increase the level of security that is in place. Okay, so that is just bringing you up to speed with where TPR is. Going back to the TPR homepage, worth checking what they issue. They are putting out new stuff, certainly on a weekly basis, if not more frequently. So we'll keep you up to speed on developments, but you can also have a look at that. And now we're going to go into some of the questions that we've had from all of you. Just a quick point, there were some initial issues with the sound for some of you. There's a mixture of issues going on here. Obviously, we are all operating our IT systems from home, and there can be some issues with the speed of broadband, which then impacts on this, and it might also be that that's the case at your end as well. So we're doing everything we can to make sure that you get a clear sound signal. Hopefully the recording will be fine, so that if there are any parts you need to go over, that will be available, and a composite Q&A document will also be available. And if there's anything you'd like us to cover, just drop it in one of the questions and we'll pick up the phone and go over it. So let's focus on the job retention scheme in detail and look at some of these questions. So the first one, Richard, what happens to member status on furlough?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Actually, just before I dive into this one, just to pick up some of the recurring themes on the Q&As that people are sending in. Yes, 2,500 a month is still the current cap. There hasn't been any change to that. 3 weeks is, yes, the minimum that furlough leave can apply for. And number 3, sick pay. So sick pay is separate to furlough leave. You can't be on both at the same time. If you're on sick pay currently, you would then go on to furlough pay, but they can't cross over each other. So those 2 or 3 were just cropping up with a lot of frequency. Also, salary sacrifice is very popular, and we'll come on to that as part of these Q&As. So member status, I've touched on this. Very important to check what rules say when an employer is furloughing their members, because we have certainly seen rules already, absence rules, eligibility rules, which would mean there is a change from active to deferred status. And again, to remind you, the basic position is there is not a change in the employment status for furlough, but you do need to check your scheme rules because of the importance, in particular in DB, defined benefit world, of triggering Section 75 debts, of calculating benefits, in particular at the moment in relation to early retirement and redundancy benefits. So the actual employment status of a furloughed employee does not change, but you do need to check the member status.
Okay, so what about carrying out consultation during a lockdown?
Yes, thanks, Ian. What about it? Well, this has cropped up a lot already. If you're already in a 60-day consultation, for example, then you are absolutely fine to continue. And if you're about to launch, which many of you may well be, then that is also acceptable. The key point is that all of the affected members and their representatives have got full and proper access to IT systems and member comms to allow a full and proper consultation as would be usual. On the employment side, for those more in the HR side of things on this webinar, Generally, that is the same for employment terms and variation, terms and condition changes, potential dismissal and re-engagements. So those consultation processes, be they 30 or 45 days on collective bases, are still acceptable. There's one minor wrinkle around dismissals and redundancies in terms of individual meetings, but it is possible for an exceptional circumstances application to be made. So yes, you can carry on consulting during lockdown.
Right, I'm almost nervous to ask this question, because whenever you combine TUPE, the Transfer of Undertakings Protection of Employment, with any subject, it gets complicated, and I have a feeling this is not going to be an exception. So what happens to furloughed employees and scheme members who are on a TUPE transfer?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And you're not just, yeah, well, how long have you got? And you're not just, and you're not just nervous because we rehearsed about 10 minutes before the webinar started. So let's move to the basic analysis. So it's important, only employees who are on an employer's payroll on 28th of February can be placed on furlough leave, and that can only be effective from 1 March at the earliest. That's important for TUPE. Second point, again, furloughed employees remain employees, okay, of the transferor at the point of transfer, as long as they haven't left the business. And we consider that they will be assigned to the transfer. So those of you who work more on the employment HR side will be used to this, just identifying who is actually going to transfer, the organised group of employees, or if there'd been a service provider change. So they will transfer. They are the employees who are transferring to the receiving employer. Furloughed employees will be assigned to the transfer because, as part of the grant application scheme, employers have to confirm that the employees will return to the business. So that is crucial, because otherwise they wouldn't necessarily be assigned to the transfer. So that's the first 2 points. Just starts to get a little bit more tricky from here. So this is difficult. It's not currently clear that a receiving employer, so a transfer employer, will not, whether they will receive funding for employees on furlough leave. In other words, if employees on furlough leave happen to TUPE transfer to you on the 15th of March, as a receiving employer, it doesn't, as things stand, clearly appear that you will be able to receive or continue to receive funding for those furloughed employees, basically because you didn't employ them on the 28th of February. Now, the immediate thought around this is how is any employer going to take a number of furloughed employees when they will not be funded? So at present, that seems to indicate that employers might then have to look at redundancies, for example. My understanding is that this is a point that is still being questioned with the government. But at present, and if anyone does have information on that, very happy to listen to you or just send us in a note. But that is a difficult area at the moment. And then 4, I suppose, back to the world as we used to know it. So the usual TUPE transfers in terms of pensions, and also the additional regulations we put on the slide, the TEP regulations, so the pension protection provisions. So TUPE clearly does not apply to benefits which are old age, invalidity, or ill health. So they will only apply to transfer early retirement redundancy benefits, for example, otherwise known as Beckman and Marsden benefits. But they would transfer, for example, contractual entitlements to a certain level of contribution into a GPP, for example. You then have to analyse at the TUPE transfer the impact of the TEP provisions. So to the extent that transferring employees are active members in occupational schemes, then the receiving employer has to make a minimum provision after transfer. That is the usual position, ignoring furlough leave. Clearly, then you add in furlough leave and you have to analyse the earnings basis for benefit calculations. So defined benefit actives or furlough employees become deferred, which is the final salary, which would be the calculation basis. That needs consideration. And finally, as if we all needed a fifth point on 2P, there could be redundancies clearly in the current environment after furloughing comes to an end. So employers will need to be considering the scheme provisions on redundancy benefits, early retirement benefits, which generally clearly are enhanced and expensive. And also, again, managing the Section 75 risk, because there is so much going on in terms of employees at the moment. It would be fairly easy to accidentally trigger a Section 75 debt when employees are moving between normal employment to furloughing to redundancy, for example. So somebody within your organisations needs to carefully manage the movement of active members. And finally, just to mention, as I flagged earlier, Beckman and Martin benefits, which are those benefits which are pensions benefits that do transfer on 2P and relate to, broadly speaking, early retirement benefits and redundancy benefits. So hopefully that's picked up some of the 2P interactions with furlough, but do send in more questions if you have them. I think, yep, on to the next one.
So, salary sacrifice, and I've already had my own personal question about a gym membership on salary sacrifice answered by you, Richard, so thanks for that. But for everyone else, how does salary sacrifice interact with the scheme? So, for example, will the reimbursement of 80% of salary be on the basis of the pre-sacrifice or the post-sacrifice salary?
So, as we've laid out, we're looking at the amount which an employee is entitled to. So looking at the reimbursement based on the post-sacrifice salary. Employees agree to salary sacrifice based on a percentage deduction, usually, or sometimes a flat rate amount, so £50 a week, £100 a week, even in the pensions world. Some employers give employees a choice. Now, again, moving on to the contractual side, and depending on what type of flex arrangements employers might have in place, there may be a need to vary these salary sacrifice arrangements, because if employees are dropping in their level of pay, but the salary sacrifice amounts stay the same, whether that be 100 or 500, for example, a month, then that would seem to be a disproportionate increase in the level of the sacrifice compared to the pay. So that's the first point on salary sacrifice.
So another couple of questions. What about salary sacrifice pension contributions? Should gross pay be reduced for any salary sacrifice benefits, including pensions?
Yep, so the amount of gross pay is the amount payable after salary sacrifice. Yep, sorry, I'm enjoying the little Q&A session.
I was just going to say, what can the employer claim salary sacrifice pension contributions as a normal pension contribution?
So we've touched on this previously. HMRC is only paying auto-enrolment employer contributions on qualifying earnings, so those are the band earnings, up to the statutory minimum 3%. So the qualifying earnings between the lower threshold and the upper threshold.
Okay. We've got one final question on salary sacrifice, and one rogue question that will actually be dealt with on the next slide, because it isn't about salary sacrifice, but for the salary sacrifice one, should employers use the post or pre-salary sacrifice amount in their claim to HMRC?
Yeah, so, oops, sorry, just I'm seeing another salary sacrifice question coming in actually. So the salary on which they're basing the claim to HMRC, employers, as we put on the slide, should use the lower post salary sacrifice amount, because that's the amount of salary to which an employee is legally entitled.
Okay. And so, as if by magic and repeated, a question specifically about trustees and furlough. So obviously a lot of trustees, either individual trustees or directors of trustee companies, are also employees of the sponsor. What happens about those trustees who've been furloughed from their employment?
Yeah, so we do think it's acceptable for furloughed trustees, be they on the member or employer side, to continue with their trustee role. And this is basically because it's entirely separate from their employment role, and because they're not usually paid for the trustee role. So it simply wouldn't fall within the regime, and they could continue to do their role. There are some tweaks obviously around who pays them, if they are paid, if the scheme pays, or if the employer pays. But our view is that trustees who've been furloughed can continue to carry out their trustee duties, and they are going to be very sought after at this difficult time, is our experience.
Yeah. So one final question. We are just at time, and I think we will run over just by a couple of minutes if you bear with us. On insured benefits, on life assurance and permanent health insurance, how will life insurance work? So if someone dies whilst they're on furlough leave, what will the insurer pay out? Presumably, question being, is it the 80% or the 100%?
Yeah, again, so as we touched on previously, go to the definitions wherever they sit within your documents, and including the policy documents to see what is covered. We think that insurers are looking closely at their own contracts to establish exactly what they have committed to paying in these types of circumstances. And also, I'm sure some of you on this call have already been involved in discussions about force majeure in contracts. In other words, whether actually current circumstances do allow for the fulfillment of commercial contracts. So I think that sort of finishes off that set of Q&As. Clearly, we've now had over nearly 70 questions coming in. We unfortunately do not have the time to answer all of those now, but we certainly will be doing so, and do continue to send them in.
It's quite remarkable, because sometimes we have done webinars where we have to plant questions.
Yeah.
And we've certainly not had to do that here. So what we're going to do is make sure that if you've left your name and we can contact you, we will be able to get in contact with you. And for everyone who's on the call, as well as having a recording of the webinar, we'll be able to put together some of the more common themes of the Q&As. And if you can't wait until then, we do have a range of material that you might find useful. There's a very detailed employment insight, so this from our employment team, which is available to read. The webinar that they put out earlier in the week will also soon be available as a recording. You can read our pensions insight, which focuses on the pension regulator's approach in a bit more detail. We also have a trustee checklist, which is quite a handy, high-level set of things for trustees to think about. Given that there are so many things to think about, it can be quite useful to have those set out as a checklist. And then finally, from across the firm, we have experts who've put their thoughts together in a COVID-19 guide that covers some fantastic stuff. So we've done pensions, employee benefits and employment today, but if you're thinking about contracts, force majeure, other areas, banking and insurance, then please do go and download and share that guide. So that is all from me and Richard. Just before we do say goodbye, I would just like to make one plug. We've just launched a new regular pensions podcast called The Month in Pensions. So if any of you are wanting more audio entertainment in the pensions world, and you haven't got completely tired of my voice, then if you search in your usual podcast provider for The Month in Pensions, you'll be able to download March edition and subscribe to get up to date with what's happening in pensions in under half an hour, which is not a bad deal as far as I'm concerned. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Richard, for your time.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you for all the questions. Like we say, we will be getting back on all of those. And so from both of us and from the pensions team at Gowling WLG, thanks for joining us and goodbye.
Thank you.